As I'm joined right now by former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pifer, along with Peter Baker, MSNBC political analyst and chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Gentlemen, good to have you both here. Peter, you first, because you've covered about, 3 decades or so of administrations with meetings between world leaders and sitting presidents. What went through your mind when you witnessed that whole episode?
It's a great question. You're right. Since 1996, except for 4 years in Moscow, I've been covering meetings at the White House between presidents and foreign leaders. And we've never seen anything like this. Never. No. That doesn't mean there are not tensions. Obviously, American presidents feel frustrated at times with even their closest allies, and sometimes they have some pointed words in front of the cameras, but you never see this kind of a verbal brawl in public like this. And it seemed at some point to be, if not intentional, at least they didn't seem to shrink away from it. They wanted, I think, in some ways, to put him back in his box, if you will. Look, President Trump and Vice President Vance have made very clear they don't like Volodymyr Zelensky. It's personal. They think Ukraine is not the victim; it's the villain in all this, and they're basically, using a lot of the points that Vladimir Putin has offered.
All of that, what you just said, is stunning. But let me go to you, Ambassador Pifer, because you said, sir, of JD Vance in this meeting that he could not have done more damage and created greater joy in Moscow were he a Russian agent. So can you explain how unprecedented this was, and can this kind of damage to our foreign relations be repaired?
Well, as Peter said, what we saw yesterday in the White House was unprecedented, and I'm sure it caused great jubilation in Moscow. This meeting was a chance for President Zelensky and President Trump to talk about how to move forward on brokering an end to the Russia-Ukraine war. And they never had that chance. I think JD Vance blew that meeting up intentionally. I don't understand why. But it's bad not just for Ukraine. I would argue that critical American interests are going to be affected by how the war between Russia and Ukraine plays out. And if Ukraine loses, either as the result of losing on the battlefield or losing as a result of a shoddy negotiated effort, that's going to be bad for American interests, because you're then going to see Vladimir Putin emboldened, and I do not believe his ambitions end with Ukraine. It'll be a bigger threat for Europe, and it'll be a bigger threat for the United States. And I worry that President Trump and the Vice President do not understand that.
Peter, you wrote what really seemed to get under Trump's skin was Zelensky's harsh words for Putin. So look, you mentioned you worked for, 4 years there in Moscow reporting on Vladimir Putin. How is he interpreting Friday's scene in the Oval Office, and why does Trump want to defend him so strongly?
Well, this is one of the essential mysteries still of President Trump's time on the public stage, and we really haven't answered. For 10 years, we have been asking the question, why does he like Vladimir Putin so much when no other American president would use the kind of words that he does, especially about a president of Russia who has invaded his neighbor and been at war with him now for 11 years, not just the last 3. And that has never seemed to be a problem for Trump. He has been an admirer of Trump's. He called him just this week, he called him cunning and smart. He calls Zelensky a dictator. Of course, Putin is the real dictator. Zelensky is a popularly elected president in a functional, if not perfect, democracy. But you're right. I mean, it was fascinating at this meeting yesterday, the things that seemed to bug Trump was every time Zelensky said something nasty or what he perceived to be nasty about Putin, he says, well, you can say bad things about him, but that doesn't help. And then later on the lawn, in that clip you showed when he's leaving the White House in the South Lawn, he says he just says negative things about Putin, as if that bothered him. And he spoke about Putin as if they were the friends and compatriots. He says, we went through the Russia investigation together, in effect. That was a remarkable moment where he identified more with the president of Russia, who is an accused war criminal, than he did with the president of Ukraine, who is fighting for his country's survival.
Yeah. Hey, let me know if you get an answer.
Alex,
yes, sir.
Could I just add to that? The president's approach towards the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin is not working. Look over the last 3 weeks. You have seen concession after concession after concession by President Trump and the administration to Russian interests. So 2.5 weeks ago, Trump publicly says, Ukraine cannot hope to get all of its territory back. It cannot hope to join NATO. That's 2 big concessions to the Russian position before Trump even has the Russians and Ukrainians sitting down together. Then he begins to break Putin out of the isolation that Western leaders have imposed on him for 3 years by saying, I'm going to meet Putin, and we should have Putin back in the G8. And then what was particularly appalling, on Monday at the United Nations, the United States voted against a European resolution in the General Assembly calling for a just and lasting peace. We voted against it along with Russia, North Korea, and Iran. The reason the United States voted against that is because it named Russia as the aggressor. And for all of these concessions, all these move towards Russia, if you look in the last 3 weeks, the president has not gotten a single thing from Russia of benefit to the United States. In fact, the Russian position appears to be hardening. This is not the way to deal with Kremlin, not the way to deal with Vladimir Putin. Putin just sits back and says, I'm getting these concessions. I'm going to wait for Trump to make more because he sees Trump as weak.
Thought-provoking there. And you're right to point out all those things that have happened of late. Let me ask you, Peter, about the sound that we played earlier and what you make of top Republicans like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio doing these 180s on supporting Ukraine. With few exceptions, Republicans have all fallen in line with Trump after yesterday's confrontation. Will it last?
Well, I think it's a measure of how much the Republican Party has changed, right? The party of Reagan today is backing, again, Russia over Ukraine, in effect. It's Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio. These guys were hawks. These guys saw Putin as a bad guy, as a threat to the world. They saw Ukraine as a victim of unprovoked aggression. They saw Zelensky as a new Churchill, and they celebrated him this way. And to see them, as you say, turn 180 degrees on this to denounce Zelensky and to back Trump in his verbal assault on Zelensky shows you how much power Trump has over the Republicans. They don't want to cross him. They don't want to be in the chair where Zelensky is in that image you're showing. They don't want Trump to be yelling at them, and therefore they feel compelled to stay in line with him. And it's a radical change for the whole Republican Party this way.
But Ambassador, certainly heard what Marco Rubio said earlier in an interview, I believe it was on CNN, but he appeared uncomfortable during the tense exchange. How difficult will the job of Secretary of State be if the president and vice president continue undermining allies?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Alex. I mean, Secretary Rubio looked very uncomfortable in that session because he's the person who has the lead on trying to pull this negotiation together. And right now you have this rift between the United States and Ukraine. Secretary Rubio, he's met with the Russians, but again, on issues that would try to bring this negotiation closer, the Russians have not made a single move. So his job has been made immensely more difficult by what happened yesterday. And he's also, I think, looking at a situation where now the Europeans, who could be helpful, the administration would like Europe, for example, to provide a peacekeeping or reassurance force. You have this meeting tomorrow between key European leaders and Zelensky, and I think that meeting is going to talk about what can we in Ukraine do if, in fact, as it appears yesterday, the Trump administration may be preparing to throw Ukraine under the bus.
All right, Ambassador Stephen Pifer, thank you, sir, so much. Peter, I'm going to ask you to stick around because I want to ask you about the situation at the VA a little bit later in this hour.